The promised blessing given to Abraham was to bring about the Messiah through the lineage of Abraham and to continue to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. So has the promise of Abraham for Israel to become a great nation and to bless the world failed? Let's look at verses 6 through 13. But it is not that the word of God has taken no effect, for they are not all Israel who are Israel, nor are they children because they are the seed of Abraham. But in Isaac your seed shall be blessed. That is, those who are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted as the seed. For this is the word of promise, at this time I will come, and Sarah shall have a son. And not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one man, even by our father Isaac, for the children had not yet being born, nor having done anything good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him who calls, it was said to her, the older shall serve the younger. It is written, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. In verses 6 through 13, Paul is using an allegory, just as he does in Galatians chapter 4, by using Old Testament characters that his Jewish readers will be very familiar with to bring about his points in how God saves and who God saves, and God choosing messengers to bring about the promise. So Paul talks about Isaac being the one chosen by God to be a messenger to bring about God's promise. And God's promise of Isaac being chosen was an act of God's gracious choice that came about through Abraham and Sarah's faith. You have to understand that. God did not choose Ishmael, who is a picture of the flesh, to bring about God's promise. Ishmael represents the working of the flesh in keeping God's law through works to try to make the promise happen. And in verse 9, Paul mentions that Sarah giving birth to Isaac, which is contrasted with Hagar, who also represents a work of the flesh in trying to make the promise happen. But it wasn't through Hagar producing Ishmael. It was through Abraham and Sarah as an act of God's grace that came about by faith. How does God save? By grace through faith. Who does God save? Anyone who believes. You could read Romans chapter 4, verses 16 through 22 to get a very clear picture of Paul's explanation of Abraham's faith being counted as righteousness, and it's all given by grace. Isaac and Sarah are symbols of truly saved people, while Hagar and Ishmael are symbols of unregenerate, unsaved people. This has nothing to do with God's choice to save people or not to save people before the world began. Paul is using Old Testament characters as symbols to make his point to his audience, which is mainly Jewish readers and a lot of them hardened Jews, of how God saves, which is by grace through faith, and who God saves, which is anyone who believes. And that's how the promise came about. God still loved and cared about the individuals Hagar and Ishmael. You should read Genesis 21, 17 through 21. God has a blessing for Hagar and Ishmael. God did not hate Hagar and Ishmael before they were ever born. But they are pictures of the flesh, that the promise didn't come through Abraham going through Hagar and then Ishmael was produced. Abraham with Sarah in their old age, as God promised them from the beginning, that they would have the promised child, Isaac, and it came about by grace through their faith. Then moving on from Hagar, Ishmael, Sarah, and Isaac, we go to other characters Paul is introducing that the audience would be very familiar with, which are Jacob and Esau, that came from Rebekah, the twins that were born from Rebekah. Before they were even born, and not based on their morality, God chose to have Jacob be the one in whom God would deliver his promise to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth. Now, to the Jew of that day, it would not seem fair because the firstborn is the one who culturally deserved the inheritance, the blessing. But God chose in his sovereignty to give it to the one who is undeserving, which is Jacob, because Jacob was born second. And God's purpose of election, which verse 11 talks about, or choice, is that God's choice of Jacob is to be a symbol that God gives grace to the undeserving. And God saves anyone who believes, including the undeserving Gentiles. God can save whoever he wants and however he wants. This didn't seem fair to the hardened Jew who think they earn salvation by works of the law and deserve salvation through lineage. Jacob and Esau represent types of how and who God saves. In verse 12, Paul quotes Genesis 25:23. He says, 2 nations are in your womb. We are clearly dealing with nations here. That God chose the nation of Israel, not Edom, which is from Esau, the Edomites, from the point of Rebekah's womb to bring about the promised Messiah and message. God chose Jacob to be the messenger to bring about the promise, not Esau. That was God's prerogative. That was God's sovereign choice. This does not have to do with God picking Jacob to be saved and picking Esau to be damned to hell before they were ever born. That is not the point Paul is making here. He's making the point and he's illustrating, have Jacob and Esau. Esau should deserve it. Typically, he's the firstborn. But I've chosen to show that I'm going to give grace to Jacob, and he's going to be my chosen messenger to bring about the promise, even though it's culturally undeserving, as a picture to illustrate that salvation is by grace through faith, and it's for all people, the undeserving Gentiles included. And in verse 12, Paul quotes Malachi chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, about God hating the Edomites, not Esau, the individual, and loving the Israelites, not necessarily Jacob, the individual, in that specific passage of Malachi. There is a 1,500-year gap between Genesis 25, talking about when they're born, to Malachi 1, talking about God hating Edomites and loving the Israelites. 1,500-year gap between those two verses. The nation of Edom had grown hardened and opposed the promises of God over time. You can read in Obadiah, you can read, and obviously we just read in Malachi. And God, it says from the promise from the beginning, I will bless those who bless you and I will curse those who curse you. And so the Edomites were standing in opposition to the promise of God, and God hated them, the Edomites, in that sense. God never hated Esau, the person, before he was born, but hated the nation of Edom with whom they had become. Okay, and you could even say that hardened Israelites were like the Edomites of their day, where they had hardened themselves and opposed the Messiah and opposed the promises of God and the gospel of grace. Deuteronomy 23:7 says, you shall not detest an Edomite, for he is your brother. So God is telling his own people, don't hate the Edomites. And that word hate is actually, could also mean a lesser love. Just like Jesus said, unless you hate your father and mother and so on and so forth, you cannot, and your wife, you cannot follow me. So God is not asking us to hate our spouse literally with a hatred and disdain. There's a lesser love there. And God had a lesser love for Esau in his preference for choosing Jacob to be the chosen messenger. And Jacob was a wicked, sinful man too. Jacob was a liar and he deceived. He was the heel catcher, right? The choosing of Jacob was not based on morality, but based on God's gracious choice to be his chosen messenger. So the hardened Jew, hearing that God chose Jacob to bring about God's promise instead of Esau, is painting the picture that God saves whoever he wants. And we know that he saves those who believe in him, even the Gentiles. That is the whole conclusion that Paul is trying to get to when you get to the end of Romans 9. Paul is painting the picture that the Gentiles who did not pursue a righteousness by works, but they pursued it by faith, they attained it. But the Jews totally missed it because they tried to achieve it by works, and they stumbled over the stumbling stone, Jesus. That's the point Paul is trying to get to. If you read the end of Romans 9, it helps the rest of Romans 9, starting with verse 1, going into the end, make sense. What is the point Paul is trying to get to in Romans 9? How does God save? Who does God save? He's going to fulfill his promise even through hardened Israel.